Hello, Garland Nixon here, and it looks like another NATO puppy army is in the process of biting the dust. Let's talk. Hello, Garland here. And, I found an interesting article. We're going to talk about that. That was a good wake up call for me about this whole thing. But let's start with something. Let's go backwards. And I think we got to go here before we get started. Okay. This is a transcript. I recall this so well. And so we're going to start by talking about this from Afghanistan, right? Here's an article. President Joe Biden offered an apparent quid pro quo to the since fled president of Afghanistan. If you remember that, what happened in Afghanistan is what happens time and time again. At the end of the Afghanistan to do, as it fell apart, at the end, the president, ostensible president, the puppet that the U.S. had installed as the supposed leader of the quisling leader of Afghanistan, left the country in a plane with has been alleged by some of his top appointees that he had $160 million in cash in US dollars, and that as he left, money was literally like falling out of vehicles, falling out of stuff. As he headed onto the tarmac, they were dropping suitcases full of US dollars. He was loaded to the gills, and he was running out. And that's what the way the things end. I've always said at some point that's the way this Ukraine situation may end for Zelensky if he's lucky. But at any rate, so that's the way it ends. Well, something happened just before then that's pertinent to what we're about to talk about. So the things were falling apart. The puppet from Afghanistan apparently got on the phone with Joe Biden and basically stated the obvious: hey, the Taliban are overrunning us. And Biden, let's listen to this. So here's the way we go. Biden instructed this guy to lie, and he says, things aren't going well in terms of the fight against the Taliban, and there's a need. This is a Biden. Things aren't going well in terms of the fight against the Taliban. That was an understatement. The president of Afghanistan had called him and said, we're getting overrun. We're toast. We're done. We're history. Our guys are all getting, we got to get the hell out of here, right? So Biden, interpreted things aren't going well. They weren't going well from the perspective of the people of the Afghan puppet army. They were getting shot, slaughtered, like mowed down wood. But from the perspective of Joe Biden sitting in the Oval Office and the Victoria Newlands and the Blinkens of the world who are down in Foggy Bottom eating a delicious dinner with a nice white wine, things were not going well, right? And there's a need. So this is Biden. Things aren't going well in terms of the fight against the Taliban. And there's a need, whether it is true or not. That's the word. There is a need, whether it is true or not. There is a need to project a different picture. In other words, hey man, things ain't. This puppet army is getting wiped out. And here's what we need you to do. We need a lie. Now, keep in mind, who was that lie for? It was for us. It was for the American people. It was the people in the West. It was the Taliban knew they were winning. The puppet army that the U.S. had created and armed knew they were losing. The president of Afghanistan had called them and said, "Hey guys, things ain't going well. We're losing. I'm getting out of here. I'm packing up my cash right now." So Biden said, we need a perception of the American people. The American people can't know the truth. And he says, to project a different picture, we need to lie. It's Biden. Biden told President Ghani, If you empower the defense minister, Bismillah Khan Mohammed, to execute a strategy focused on key parts of the population center, you're going to not only get more help, but you're going to get a perception that it is going to change. You're going to get more help. Well, first of all, let me ask you this. The guy called to say that his military was in the process of collapsing. Hey, man, we're getting overrun. All right, we're going to get more help. What does that mean? Does it mean money? Does it mean that $160 million in cash that he ran out with? That would usually that would what is what I would think. The guy Biden says to him, if you lie, you're going to get more help. A week later, this guy's running out of the country with $160 million in cash, and the Biden administration ain't saying a word about it. Perhaps they gave him the $160 million. Hey, yes, I'd be happy to lie, but it's going to cost you $160 million in U.S. taxpayer funds. Is that all? Is that all? Right? Biden went on to pledge consistent airport, blah, blah, blah. We will continue to provide close air support if we know what the plan is and what we are doing. If we know what we are doing, well, I think we know the answer to that. We don't know what we're doing. What is that all about? What is that all about? And I got another article. So, and how does that relate to Ukraine? What happened in Korea? And excuse me, what happened in Vietnam, right? The U.S. armed and trained South Vietnam, right? So we armed and trained the South Vietnamese army, and we said, oh, now we said, but we're going to have to put in our army to help them. So we armed and trained the South Vietnamese army, and we put our army in to help them. And we went up against the North Vietnamese, and who were they armed and trained by? China and Russia. So the U.S. had a proxy army, and in that instance, they put in their own army along with the proxy army and still got kicked the hell out of Vietnam. So that proxy army didn't work out so well. And then we just talked about Afghanistan. They spent 20 years, and what did they leave? Like $100 billion worth of military gear. When they left, I read articles that said the Taliban army, based on what the U.S. left behind, had the most heavily armed military, one of the most heavily armed militaries in the world. So the U.S. basically did money laundering and just left this stuff laying in the desert. You know, let me tell you a real quick story. When I was a kid, my dad was a longshoreman. He worked on ships, loading ships, right? And I remember him telling me about this excavation equipment that was huge. You've seen those gigantic bulldozers and things like that. And he said the Saudis, they would send some to the Saudis on their oil fields. And he knew some of the guys that went together because some of them they'd take apart, put it on the ship, put it back together, right? So they'd send that stuff. And he said the Saudis would use it. And some of these countries were very, very wealthy. They would use this huge equipment that cost millions and millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars back then. And when they got done, they just leave it sitting out in the desert and rust, or they just dig a hole and bury it. They could care less. They didn't need it. It was too expensive to move it to somewhere else. Forget it. I'll buy more. That money was no object, right? And that's kind of what the U.S. did. There was instances where the Saudis had went to African countries and they wanted to have conferences and things. So they built these beautiful hotels on these beautiful beaches in African countries. They had their conferences, and then they just left the hotels for the whatever the country was, right? So this is, you could argue wasteful spending, whatever the case, but they had it, they used it, they left it. That's what the U.S. did in Afghanistan. Spent all of this money, left all this stuff behind. Who the hell cares, right? And what happened? Their quisling government fell, and the army that they built fell apart. Now, you could make an argument as to why. We could discuss that forever. Clearly, the people weren't motivated. You got people that are just doing it for money. You've got, they're going to get so much help from the U.S. and who you could talk about their fighting strategies, etc. I'm not Scott Ritter. I'm not Andre Martinyov. I'm not some of these guys, even Brian Berletic, some of these people that understand military. Martianov, my mistake. But I can say this. It's obvious that something they were doing wasn't all that well, didn't work well, wasn't working well at all. So what do we have? We have a history of the U.S. building proxy armies that just get crushed oftentimes. And in the instance of the Afghans, look, how well armed were their opponents? These guys had friggin' Toyota trucks. They had a Toyota truck with a machine gun mounted in the back. Literally, a bunch of guys running around with Kalashnikovs and Toyota trucks easily overran the U.S. proxy army. Vietnam, you had a bunch of guys that they were just angry. They believed in what they were fighting for, and the U.S. had everything in the world you could do. We used the U.S. military, ran their asses right out of Vietnam. The history of U.S. proxy armies look, as you know, you hear me say this all the time. The credit goes to former New York Giants and New York Jets coach Bill Parcells. You are what your record says you are. The U.S. proxy armies, if you want to know how the proxy armies in Ukraine will fare, look at the history of U.S. proxy armies. Name one that they put together that has fought mightily and won battles. That may be a battle here and there, but overall they tend to get crushed. They tend let's face it, they put this army together in Afghanistan, and when the Taliban attacked them with Toyota trucks. Now, no, that's not to belittle Toyota trucks. First of all, let me tell you something. One of the finest trucks in the world, Toyotas. I'm a Toyota guy. They run. They run. But you're not supposed to be able to beat a military with a bunch of 2006 four-cylinder Tundras, right? But for some reason, that's why I say if I was Russia and China, man, I'd mass produce Toyota trucks, because apparently that's kryptonite to U.S. troops, U.S. trained troops. But at any rate, I digress. I don't want to get carried away on silliness. So I found this great article, and we're going to talk about this article. Really fantastic. And here's the article. It is inda.ca right? That's interesting. Inda.ca. Indica. What good is a NATO trained army? And the first thing they show in that picture, is, look at this, a bunch of bunched up, look at this, a bunch of bunched up military vehicles in Ukraine, all blown to hell. Now, here's the thing about it. Bunched up like that, it ain't hard to blow them up. I mean, how many rounds does it take? I mean, I put it like this. Here's the first problem. You see that little road they got? One of the issues that they have is this. One of the issues that they have is they had these minefields that they had to navigate. And so they would have like a minesweeper, and the minesweeper would start going through the roads. And so they had to follow through a minesweeper, which meant you got a narrow little road with a bunch of people bunched up. And if you are involved in targeting, that's shooting fish. Look at that. I'm not a military guy, but I can look at that and say, for the military, that is shooting fish in a barrel. The U.S. taxpayers, the German taxpayers, the British taxpayers bought all of this stuff at a high price, sent it over there. They bunched it up in a little group and drove it down the teeth of the Russian defense and got it blown to hell. And if you're, and here's the other part of a proxy army. There's two things. One being, one of the reasons that they perform so poorly is that stuff, they half-ass train them, and the tactics that they use are questionable, to say the least. The other part of it is this: the U.S., the people, their patrons don't really care about them, so they just throw them to the dogs. Who cares about these guys? Put them out there. Who cares about their lives? Whatever. They're cannon fodder. So in that they are cannon fodder, they are thrown into the cannons and they're blown apart. But look at that. That doesn't seem like good. I'm just saying, doesn't seem like good tactics. If you can't do any better than bunch all your stuff together and drive out into the middle of a minefield, you're probably better off if that offensive doesn't happen. But because it's not a military offensive, it is a political offensive. Remember, NATO puppet armies are not military entities. They're political entities. Think about that. It's a political entity that appears, that manifests itself as a military entity. Dude, political entities can't fight. A military. And so political entities use political strategies. Military entities use military strategies. You see, my dear friends, attacking The Russian military, which is a superpower military on its border, when it's proclaiming months ahead that you're going to attack them and where you're going to attack them. So in standard military form, they can build up standard defenses, layered defenses that you don't have a prayer against. That is not a military tactic, but it is a political tactic, because they needed to say, we're building an offensive, so everybody give us, we need stuff for the offensive. Well, that's a political tactic. That's an act of politics. We're going to do something. So unfortunately, a military tactic would be, I never tell you where I'm going to strike. I never tell you when I'm going to strike. That's a military tactic. A political tactic is, I tell you everything I'm going to do. And the reason being is because politically, I need support from the people at home to keep throwing money into this morass. And I need support from these other countries to keep giving me stuff for this offensive, so I can tell you where the offensive was. But that's political. And if you use political tactics on a battlefield, you're going to lose. The people who are fighting a political fight in a military environment are going to die. They're going to get blown to hell. And that picture there shows you exactly what happens when you use political tactics in a military environment. Now let's keep going. This is a great article, so we're going to talk about it. Our friend here over at Indica says that they talk about NATO, but here's what they say, and this is brilliant. Every U.S. NATO trained army for nearly 70 years has collapsed or lost half their country. What makes you think Ukraine is going to be any different? There you go. They talk about, just as South Vietnam, their army collapsed. South Korea, right? Their army is South Korea is divided. Iraq, remember we were training an Iraqi army. Remember this? The U.S. was training an Iraqi army, blah blah blah, arming an Iraqi army, all this kind of crap. And what happened in northern Iraq when they were attacked by ISIS? But most of a huge portion of Iraq fell apart. They weren't fighting. They couldn't fight. They ran and abandoned and left their posts. So another NATO puppet army gone, shot to hell, right? Afghanistan collapsed, right? So the guy says, and he goes on to say, and he talks about this, what is it that NATO can do? And Andrei Martyanov talked about this. What can they do? They can go bomb some country that doesn't have air defenses, that doesn't have really a military, that just have kind of volunteered private military units or whatever, or has some old, 1950s Soviet era stuff. They can go in and bomb them. They can do that. They can attack them, and then they can say, look what we did. It's the equivalent of me walking up, and there's a puppy, and kicking the puppy up in the air and saying, look how tough I am. I defeated my opponent. It's a puppy. It has no way to defend itself. That doesn't show that I'm strong. In fact, it shows that I'm weak. And that's what they do. No air cover. That's what they're used to fighting. Hey, we're going to go. Excuse me. The people that they're fighting in these countries have no air cover. Now, what has happened in Ukraine? It's the other way around. I've said this for a while, and they talk about this. You're going to go to the border of a superpower whose military has been trained, designed to do one thing: defend its western border. The Russians have been attacked on their western border over and over again, and their military is designed to protect that western border. I truly believe, I could be wrong, that the Russians are using a minuscule portion of their military potential, because they're holding out in case NATO decides to attack them. So they're just using a little bit what they have to do. Plus, they're in no rush. They're in no hurry. The longer this thing goes on, the more the sooner, the more damage is done to NATO. So and keep throwing this stuff in here so we can blow it up. You're making our lives easier. And the more stuff we blow up, the harder it gets for you to attack us. So the longer this goes on, the harder it gets, the more difficult, more impossible it gets for NATO to attack Russia, because they're throwing all of their gear in Russia, allowing Russia to blow it up. And the harder it gets for NATO to fight China or anybody else. So they're just exhausting their gear. So the Russians, I believe, are using a potential of their military, use a small of just a fragment of their military potential, and that's the wise thing to do. That's what I believe. Could be wrong. So Now, what have they done? They're accustomed. Think about this. It's a reversal of fortunes. What do? They go in, they attack these weak countries who, Libya, Afghanistan, whatever, who don't have air cover for their troops, who don't have high quality stuff, who don't really have high quality military tactics, and they beat up on countries that can't afford to fight them, right? Well, now what's going on? They're sending the Ukraine troops in with no air cover, with little or no training, with mismatched gear. That, as we've seen, one of the things that has come out, one of the things that we found is in reading, is that you got a lot of countries that have old beat up gear. And that's how people do that. If somebody asks, hey, I'll put it like this. You got a brand new lawnmower, brand spanking shiny new lawnmower, and you got that and you're using it, and you got an old beat up lawnmower sitting there, but it still runs. You were using that and you just decided, that's a piece of crap. It runs, but I don't like it. It's falling apart. I'm getting a new lawnmower, right? And you're right, we're using this new lawnmower. Your neighbor comes over and says, hey man, my lawnmower broke. Can I use yours to cut my grass? Sure, no problem. You go pull the old lawnmower out, you show how it starts. Here you go, cut your grass, right? You're going to lend them the old lawnmower. Why? It's not that you don't like your neighbor or you're stingy. It works, whatever. It's kind of beat up. You can push it around. The wheels are wiggly. Sometimes, it has some problems and chokes itself out, but it'll get the job done somewhat, as long as you baby it, Hopefully, every now and then it cuts off, but you do the best you can. You figure he can get an hour out of it to cut his grass. You ain't giving him the new lawnmower, are you? So when the U.S. says, I need tanks or whatever for Ukraine, these countries are like, we got any tanks? Yeah, we got a whole, we got 50 tanks over here, but they don't really run well. And when we get them running, these things break down all the time. And they got the old sights on them. They're really pieces of crap. Great, send them those. Get rid of them. Been meaning to get rid of that crap anyway. So what are they getting? Everybody else's broken down hand-me-downs. You got to go against the Russians. You're going into an environment of electronic warfare. The most modern army, as modern an army as you'll get, electronic warfare, high-tech anti-tank helicopters and missiles and tank hunting crews. You got mines of everything's mine. I mean, you are going into the teeth of a monster, and they're putting you in last year's beat up lawnmower with the rickety wheels that chokes itself out after an hour. You can only push it for an hour, then it's going to choke itself out. Right? That's what you're giving them. You might as well put them on a riding mower. For how long they're going to live, you might as well put them on a riding lawnmower and say, go through that minefield. It'll do just as good as what they're putting them in. You can die the same on a riding lawnmower as you can on an old beat up tank that doesn't have work. And so what do you have? You have a NATO proxy army that's crap. That's garbage. And they're going to lose, as they always do. And so let's continue to go on. And he says, and he also brings up the importance of understanding NATO. What is NATO, right? And he says, I'll use NATO and America interchangeably because the structure is effectively America and its subservient vassals, right? And this has never been more obvious. And so what is not, and here's what I got to say about that. We look at it and we say NATO has builds these proxy armies and sacrifices them to whatever neocon project is going on, right? So they build this proxy army in Afghanistan, wherever, Vietnam. They throw them to the dogs. They get torn to shreds. They get the hell out of there. So now you've got Ukraine. So they built this proxy army, NATO, which is the U.S. empire, and its vassals, who are just doing what they're told. And they build this proxy army. They throw out there, and it's getting the same. Torn to hell, but there's another war going on, and that is the economic war, the diplomatic war, right? So the other thing we got to realize is this. When you talk about NATO and its subservient vassals, whether it's Japan, whether it's South Korea, whether it's all of the European countries, Australia, Canada, etc., right? The thing about it is they are occupied by NATO, by the U.S. empire. Right? Germany is occupied. Italy is occupied. They have U.S. bases in there. Why does the U.S. need bases? To occupy its vassals, to keep them in line. And also, I will guarantee you this. What do we keep finding out? Here's an example. We found out that the Obama people were spying on Angela Merkel. We find out that Norway helps the Biden people attack Germany, and Germany just takes it. We find out that the vassals are by the are occupied and controlled by the US, and not in a benevolent way. It's not like the US empire is there to look out for Europe, to look out for their security. Australia, no, it's the opposite. It's there to utilize them as a proxy army against the world. Ukraine is a proxy army military, and they're just going to get wiped out. Who cares? They're Afghanistan, they're South Vietnam. Who cares as far as the neocons are concerned? That's what they're there for. They're cannon fodder. But now the Australians versus the Chinese, their #1 trading partner. They're being told to give up their economy and to turn into an impoverished hellhole by screwing up their a relationship with their top trading partner. What about Europe? The cheap energy and things and resources, natural resources they get from Russia. Cut that off. We recently saw the Germans say that, and I reported on this, that they have no plan without Russian energy, that if they don't get Russian energy next year, that basically their industry comes to a standstill. That's the plan. They're occupied. You got bases there, and the bases say you are now a proxy army. What happened to the South Vietnamese proxy army? Slaughtered. What happened to the Afghanistan proxy army? Ran for their lives or got slaughtered. What's happening to the Ukraine proxy army? Slaughtered. What's going to happen to Europe as a proxy army, as a proxy economic army? It's going to get slaughtered. That's what happens. You are what your record says you are. The safe bet is always consistency. So now they've weaponized Europe. Europe is a proxy army in the diplomatic and economic sphere. Remember what I said at the very beginning, and that is a proxy army is a political entity, but it's fighting in a military environment. The Ukrainian army is a political entity fighting in a military environment. They get slaughtered, right? In the same way, the European economy, the European people, the European vassals, right? They are a political entity fighting in an economic environment. People say, why did they do something so stupid? Think about this. Why would any army in its right mind announce to a powerful Russian army that they're going to launch an offensive, where they're going to launch an offensive, and when they're going to launch an offensive? Because we all know what the result, we could all predict the results. You're going to let the Russian army, and they're like, yes, the neocons are like, yes, the Russians will panic and run. And I'm thinking, did they panic and run against Napoleon, against Hitler, against who have the Russians ever panicked and ran against? I don't know if you've been paying attention to history, my friend, but panicking and running ain't something the Russian army does. They don't panic and they don't run. They come downhill at you and they end up in your capital. If it's Berlin or if it's Paris, you go to attack their capital, they gonna end up putting up a flag in yours. That's history, like it or not. You ain't got to love the Russians. You ain't got to hate the Russians. You go after their capital, they end up sticking up a flag in yours. That's history. So this idea that somehow that the Russians were going to panic and run, you ain't been reading many history books. And again, that wasn't a military statement that they're going to panic and run. It was a political statement of hope from a bunch of people who know nothing about the military, and so they can get the message across to their vassals to keep getting equipment from them and from their people to keep supporting this money laundering operation that is the Ukraine project. So again, political tactics in a military environment. Now, let's go to the same thing, because people would say, why would he's just driving out into a minefield? Because it ain't a military operation. It's a political operation. In a military operation, you never drive out in the middle of a damn minefield all bunched up together because you know you're going to die. In a political operation with a proxy army, you don't care if they're going to die, so the hell with them. Looks good. Attack, guys, but we're all going to die. Shut up and attack. I know you're going to die. That's your job. Now go do it. Now, let's go to the EU. People ask questions like this. What the hell are they doing? More sanctions? They're falling apart. They're driving out into an economic minefield, aren't they? Why would anybody drive out into an economic minefield? If you think of the European as to what they're doing as economic tactics, in the same way that if you look at, and I'm drawing this parallel, that if you look at Ukraine and say, from a military strategy standpoint, what they're doing makes no sense. But from a political strategy standpoint, I understand why the neocons are throwing them to the dogs. If you look at Europe and it's like, okay, we're cutting ourselves off from cheap Russian fuel, you're like, what the hell would we, what? You're committing suicide. You're putting a bullet in your mouth and pulling a gun in your mouth and pulling the trigger economically. Why would anybody take an economic? So you discuss it through the lens. It makes no economic sense. Why would you do that? It makes no economic sense for Europe to do. And they're like this, where our country's falling apart. The UK is a pile of economic rubble. Germany's on the way down. Politically, even from the internal politics now, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, is now moving past is you know, in the passing lane for the AfD and the Christian Democrats, all of those, the Greens. None of that makes sense from the perspective of economics, right? Makes no sense. Even internal politics of Europe makes no sense. You're going to hurt yourself and you're going to wipe out. Why in the hell would you do that? Because it is not an economic move. It wouldn't be an economic move for Germany to bite the hand that's feeding it cheap energy, would it? It was a political move by the US empire, by their patrons, by the leader of the colonies. So from the perspective of the Europeans, the stupidest thing they could possibly do would be cut themselves off from cheap natural resources and cheap energy from Russia. So you would just say to yourself, that makes no sense. And it doesn't economically. It was stupid. Politically, from the neocons and their Washington masters, it makes perfect sense. Who gives a shit? Keep throwing them everything. We've got more sanctions coming against Russia. They don't make sense, and they're going to hurt Europe. Who cares? Just keep throwing sanctions at Russia. We don't care about Europe. Europe is just another proxy army, and all proxy armies get destroyed. Afghanistan, you name it, they get destroyed. Ukraine's a proxy army. It's getting destroyed. Europe is an economic proxy army, and anybody tell me what's happening economically to Europe right now? It's getting destroyed. Proxy armies for the NATO proxy armies, history tell us they will be destroyed. They will be wiped out. And you know what the US is going to do? It's going to do what it does. Biden's going to do the same thing he did to whatever his name is, the guy president of Afghanistan. He's going to call them and he's going to say, what did he say to him? He said, things aren't going well in terms of the fight against the Taliban. And there's a need, whether it's true or not, there's a need to project a different picture. Biden told President Ghani. So you know what he's going to do? Hey, man, hey, Schultz, hey, Sunak. And they're going to be like, hey, Biden, yeah, our economy's crashing. Our people are starving. They're losing it. I look outside the window. I think they're building some gallows and guillotines for the ruling elite. What do we do? Biden's going to say, look, things aren't going well. Fair enough. But I need to project a different picture. So here's what we need to do. We need you to put out a statement that the economy's turning around, jobs are picking up, people are doing better, everything's opening back up. The Russians are fighting with shovels and washing machine chips for their missiles, and they're out of missiles. Oh, the Ukrainian military, the Azov battalion is putting up a flag any day now in Red Square that this thing is over. The Russians are begging for mercy. Now, fair enough, we understand that that's not true. But what we need is a different perception. That's all the quisling leaders of Europe are going to get. That's what the quizlings always get. That's what the traitors always get. And the best they can hope for is that, just like the president Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan, the best that Zelensky and maybe even Schultz and some of these other traitors can hope for is that they don't get hung or their heads get cut off, that they end up getting $160 million in cash and they end up taking off and leaving their country and heading to the UAE or wherever the hell I think it was the president of Afghanistan landed in the UAE. You know, the U.S. set that up for him. He left his own country, landed in the UAE, and a bunch of members of the Afghan government said, "Hey, man, that's wrong. He took all of this money. He left. We need to act on that." And the Biden administration blocked it. Where is he now? Nobody knows. We don't know. I'm sure you could find out where he is. Bottom line, he went to the UAE. He took all that money. He's living rich forever. It worked out for him. He basically turned over his country to the neocons, and in turn, they gave him some suitcases full of cash. Game over, game, set, and match for the people in Afghanistan. Now they're trying to rebuild. Well, guess what? You're getting the same thing in Europe. So the point being here, another NATO puppet army is going to collapse because all the rest of them collapse. But the other part of it is this. Go take Australia, for instance. Australia is a country of what, 25 million people, and the U.S. is saying we got to sell you some subs for $300 billion. 25 million people? How the hell are they going to pay for $300 billion? They will be impoverished. What's going to happen to their roads? Same thing has happened to the U.S. roads. What's going to happen to their infrastructure? Same thing happens to the U.S. infrastructure here. What's going to happen to any programs they may have to help the poverty, the poor, the senior, the infirmed? That's all going out the window because the U.S. is saying, look, you got to suck your budget dry and buy these submarines. Oh, really? And what are we going to do with these submarines? Well, you're going to patrol your shipping lanes and defend them. From who? From China, your number one trading partner. You're doing that to protect yourself from your number one trading partner. If China and Australia stop doing business, Australia goes out of business. They got nothing. What is the U.S. going to send them from halfway across the world? Nothing. We don't make anything. We can't send them anything. Oh, by the way, China is our number one trading partner too. So we'll be gone too. Our economy will be wiped out. So they're turning these neocons are turning Europe into an economic proxy army. They're turning Australia into an economic proxy army, and they're turning the very people, the economy of the United States, into an economic proxy army, proxy for the neocon project, which is nothing but pure fascism. All the neocon project is fascism. That's it. I'm sorry. If you want to call it something else, it's fascism. It is let's rule the world. We have a right to dominate the world. And whatever we have to sacrifice for this project, including the American people or the European people or whatever, we've got a handful of people. We've got this crazy fascist religion of ruling the world, neoconservatism. We got a handful of people who are steering this thing, and they want to sacrifice all of the rest of us for it. And the question is, are people going to wake up? Well, I did an interesting video. If you get a chance to watch it with Dr. Tony Montero about our thoughts on internal politics in the 2024 election and how these dynamics are going to affect it, I would recommend watching that, but you don't have to. The bottom line is this. What we're getting at here is the issue of proxy militaries, of proxy armies. And now we understand that the Ukrainian army has no chance. They never had a chance. Keep in mind something also. They were never supposed to have this fight. What was supposed to happen is they were supposed to set up for a fight on Russia, right? They're going to be trained. They're going to be ready to go. They're going to be militarized and weaponized. And then we're going to go to the economic warfare. We're going to put in all these sanctions against Russia, and Russia's going to collapse. So the Ukrainian military was never supposed to fight Russia for long because Russia was supposed to collapse, turn on Putin, hang him, whatever. And then we were going to take Russia, divvy it up amongst to the victor goes the spoils. That was the plan. But the Russians weren't on board with that plan. They said, we'd rather not do that plan. So as a result, we got something far different. They ended up with something they hadn't prepared for. They ended up having to actually fight a war with Russia via this proxy army. They never planned for that. They never strategized for that. The strategy was Russia's going to fall apart. And if that doesn't happen, we don't have a backup plan. So ever since Russia, they discovered that Russia wasn't going to fall apart, they couldn't stop. See, when you think about the sanctions, politically, they can't stop adding sanctions and they can't stop sanctioning Russia. To do that would be to admit weakness, to admit that the sanctions don't work anymore. And the world would look at it and say, man, they kicked your ass. The world would look at it and say, you sanctioned them. It didn't work. You had to drop the sanctions. You blinked. That the Russians said, we're all right. We got oil. We got stuff we can sell. And you were like, oh, crap. We can't sanction them. We got to back off these sanctions. To drop the sanctions, even one sanction against Russia, to start dropping the sanctions, will say to the world, you're forced to drop the sanctions. You drop the sanctions because that was the real war. You have lost. Well, they've already lost, and the world knows it. The neocons just can't admit that they lost. Furthermore, they have to keep pushing it until their vassals push back. And I have to say this: their actual vassals won't push back. The Baerbachs and the Habecks and the Schultzes and these people and the Sunaks, they ain't gonna push back. They're traitors. They're gonna do what traitors do. But what we see, and an example is in Sweden, you've got a more right-wing government now. In Germany, you've got the AfD party starting to rise. You have some alternative things starting. I'm not judging anything. I'm just saying I'm not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent. I'm just saying these are the things that's happening politically, internally in Europe. You're seeing now the political ramifications of quisling governments. At some point, the people wake up and they start to realize, enough of the people wake up, right? And then start to realize our governments don't represent us, and things start to go in a different way. When you have a government, when you're saying to the government, this is what your people want, and this is what's in the best interest of your people. However, what you're going to do is what's in the worst interest of your people, and you're not going to give them anything they want, and you're just going to lie to them. And any of those that stand up and stick their hand up and say, excuse me, sir, I'm not happy with this, you're going to lock them up, fine them, throw them in jail, and call them Russian puppets. That's the plan. Well, how long can that last? Until the people really start feeling the pain. So not only is the Ukrainian puppet army in the process of getting dashed to pieces, the European economic puppet army is in the process of getting dashed to pieces. But they ain't getting dashed to pieces by Russia. They're getting dashed to pieces by the United States. They're getting dashed to pieces by the dynamics of this of the lunatics that had no understanding of how economics worked when they pushed this, and now they're trapped in it. Now the European leaders and the US are trapped in these sanctions. It's destroying Europe. And Europe is, how do they get out of it? How do the European leaders say this was a bad idea? Sorry, guys. If they do that, they're done. If they don't do that, they're done. So at some point, they're done. And the people at home are getting pissed. Come on, let's look around. Trump is saying, hey, we need to stop, get out of this crap. Like or don't like him, Trump said it. What's RFK Jr. saying? This ain't working out so well. We need to get back off this war stuff. What's Cornel West saying? This empire war stuff is not good. We need to stop it. What is Tulsi Gabbard? She hasn't jumped in the mix. She may, I don't know. But what's Tulsi Gabbard had been saying for a long time? This Cold War crap's got to go, right? You've got voices that are getting louder and louder, and you've got people behind that are listening to those voices now. And you can find holes. I know somebody's going to be, but RFK's bad on this situation, but Trump's bad on this area, but whoever, Tulsi Gabbard's bad in this area, but Cornell, you can, but sure, I'm not talking about the areas that they're bad or good. I'm simply saying that increasingly we're getting a louder voice from all over the political spectrum that's saying at home, politically, this ain't working for us. We, the American people, don't want to be another calamitously collapsed proxy army. The Europeans don't want it. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they don't have a say in it because they have the most corrupt quizlings imaginable on humankind. I mean, you've got the Ukrainian leaders that are just filling their pockets without conscience, driving around Kiev in new Mercedes and stuff like that, about bragging. It's wonderful about how much they got. So bottom line is, all of the puppet armies are going to end up collapsed, whether it's economic a puppet army, which is Europe, or whether it's a military puppet army, which is Ukraine, because they're political machines being disguised as economic machines, being disguised as military machines. They are nothing but tools, a means to an end. And if you're fighting an economic war and you're using political tactics, and you're fighting a military war and you're using political tactics, you can't win because you're using the wrong tactics. It's like going to Chicago But you got a map of Detroit and you drive around. And think about this. You drive around and you can't find your way around. And somebody says, we're going to give you a new car, the finest new car. That's what they're doing in Ukraine. They got the wrong map. They give you the finest new, here's a brand new Mercedes and Tesla, whatever, drive it, do whatever you want. Okay, great. And we're going to train you more. We're going to train you how to use the car. We're going to train you how to drive. We're going to train you how to read maps, blah, 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 blah. We're going to give you the finest training in the world. And now we want you to navigate, take people around Chicago, but you got a map of Detroit. I don't care how much training, I don't care how good of a vehicle you have, you ain't going to be able to find your way around because you got the wrong map. You can't get there from here, as REM said, right? If you are in Ukraine and you're fighting the Russians and you got a political map, you can't ever win. I don't care how much they train. Look, the guy in Chicago, would giving him a new car help? No. So would giving the latest wonder weapons to the Ukrainians help? No. Would training this guy to drive this car better help? No, he's got a map of Detroit. He's in Chicago. Would training them, the Ukrainians, to use these weapons they have help? No, they got a map of Detroit. They're in Chicago. They got a military battle, and they're fighting it with political tactics. I don't care what you give them. If you tell the Russians for the last 6 months that you're going to attack them and where you're going to attack them from, because politically that's what you have to do, I think they're going to be prepared for you. And who wouldn't? Hey, Garland, I'm coming to your house to kill you Thursday. Really? Thursday? What time? About 8. And what's your plan? Well, I'm going to come through the front door with a knife and stab you at 8 o'clock. I'm going to be ready. I might just leave and not be home. I might have a Rottweiler. You open the door. All right, Garland. And 5 Rottweilers lunge upon you and tear you to pieces. Why? You told me where you were going to attack me, where and why and how and what your tactics were going to be. Well, you got the wrong map. And that's the bottom line. Ukrainians, and again, what about the Europeans politically, right? Ask yourself, what the hell are they doing? Hey, we're going to sanction the Russians. Remember this? We're going to stop. We'll fix the Russians as of such and such date. We're going to stop using Russian oil. That'll fix them. And we'll stop using Russian gas. And I thought to myself, the Russians have oil and gas. Everybody in the world needs oil and gas. They'll be able to sell that. But your ass is grass because you need that. Where are you going to get it from? The U.S. is going to sell it to you from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times what they sell it to everybody else. They're taking advantage of you. But it doesn't matter because this is political stuff going on. Politically, they're taking advantage of Europe and they're extracting money from Europe. The U.S. empire is doing what they do. They're extracting money from Europe. They're taking advantage of them. They're cutting off their supply of oil and gas, and then they're selling it to them at a much higher price. They're extracting money from their colonies because they need more money, and they're extracting it. They can't just print it like they used to, so they got to steal it from those guys. So what are you doing? Proxy, economic proxy army, Europe, Calamity. You're crashing. You're look, because I got to look at. Let's take a peep. Wow, we got 1,100 people. I should have 1,100 likes. Please. All right. I'm sure I do have enough time. I'm making enough time. That's for darn sure. I'm going to find some super chats if it's the last thing I do, because I know it's awesome. All right. Usually have good questions. Sparky, the one and only, says, make Ukraine Russia again. Well, you know that's going to happen in the end. In Ukraine's going to be under Russia. Brian Burner, thanks a lot there, Brian. Double B. How about this? Sparky, why go to war with China? Why not just compete with him? After all, the U.S. actively put China where they are in the first place in the last 25 years. Right. Well, the military-industrial complex is trying to make a lot of money by selling stuff for that. They're the real. And also, Sparky, understandably, Cornel West went to Green Party for more ballot access, but they are affiliated with the warmonger Green Party in Europe. I hope not. No, it's totally different. The War Party here, the War Party, listen to me. The Green Party here, to be quite frank, is in disarray a lot. They don't have a lot of, they don't really have a lot of strategy. It's kind of falling apart. They ran this idiot warmonger and CIA puppet named Howie Hawkins, and he besmirched the name of the Green Party. What an idiot. But bottom line is this. There are people who are trying to regain some structure to the party so they can get it. What they do have is ballot access. That's why he went there, because what's the point of running if you can't get any votes? So the Green Party has ballot access. I expect the Democrats to do everything they can to take that ballot access from them, but they have it. And so it was it was a practical move. So yeah, it was a practical move. He did the right thing. All right. I think, and that's great. It's great. John Ashley Smith, rock on, Garland. Thanks a lot. Let's go to Rockfin and see if anybody there had something to say. All right. Eleanor Johnson, thank you. Daniel Cutter, thank you. Wayne, my wife had advanced cancer and none of the conventional therapies work with it. Oh, he's doing it. That's the Rick oil guy here. Well, Wayne, Rick Simpson oil. Okay, whatever. There's always going to be one of those in there. We always, or we'll have somebody in that it's like, hey, my name is Heather. Go to my webcam for sexy pics. You get those every now and then. There's always somebody trying to make a crooked dollar in our chat room. Thanks a lot. All right, everybody. I made my point. Certainly appreciated everybody coming on. Make sure you share this. Hit the like button. Share this on all your social media platforms. Last but not least, you see everything going across. If you can afford to do Patreon.com and donate, I appreciate it. Buy me a coffee is always good. Buy me a coffee is pretty simple. You go on buymeacoffee.com and you can it'll say buy Garland a coffee, $5. It's like buymeacoffee.com /Garland to H. Also, Buy Me a Coffee is now just like Patreon. You could say, buy Garland a monthly coffee for $5 or 10 or 20, whatever you can afford. I appreciate it. You got my Cash App information there. And of course, there's Rockfin. If you can afford it, you can become a subscriber at Rockfin. If you can't, just become a member. Members get all of this stuff. Everything I'm putting out, you're going to get. If they throw me off YouTube or YouTube censors me, you can find it on Rockfin, because Rockfin's a free speech platform. So become a member, costs nothing, and they don't have advertisements. It's great, and it's free speech. It's great. Don't forget, there's lots of other shows on Rockfin. Look around, lots of great stuff. Everybody's over there on Rockfin, and a lot of shows that are only there. Well worth your while to peep around on Rockfin. And if you can afford it, please become a subscriber to Rockfin. It costs $14.99 a month. But if you join for a year, they knock off a couple months, so it comes to like $12 or something. If you can afford it, every Wednesday morning from 9 to 10 at 10 a.m., I have Scott Ritter on, and we do an hour for my subscriber-only show. So that's what you get, the show every Wednesday morning with Scott Ritter as a subscriber, and you get to help support the channel. You donate. So thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks a lot, Chicken Patty, of course. And last but not least, cheers from Germany, Blex. Thanks a lot, Blex. Best of luck and work hard to make change in Germany. Peace. I'm out.